Chapter 29. Back on the Move. When the Muslims arrived in Medina after the conclusion of their peace agreement with the Quraysh, the Prophet let them rest for only a few weeks before he called on them to be ready again for a major encounter with the enemies of Islam. One should remember here that the Quraysh represented only one of the three major sections of people hostile to Islam. The other two were the Bedouin Arabs, scattered all over Arabia and always on the lookout for a chance to attack Muslims and cause them some harm, and the Jews. As has been seen, three major encounters took place between the Muslims in Medina and the three leading Jewish tribes in that city. Now, the main center of Jewish concentration in Arabia was Khaybar, which was in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, quite a long way from Medina. In Khaybar, the Jews were wavering between their burning desire to launch a successful attack on the Muslims and their fear that their renewed efforts might have the same result as earlier ones. Their wish to resume the fight against Islam was almost as strong as their keenness not to do something which would threaten their very existence. They realized that their enemy was neither weak nor cowardly. Indeed, they knew that the Muslims could not be easily overcome, regardless of the size of the forces allied against them. Yet the Jews wanted to put an end to Islam, so they could not bring themselves to accept the idea of coexistence with the new faith. Their leaders, one after the other, followed the same hostile line, conspiring against the Prophet and joining every effort and every campaign launched against Islam. It was from Khaybar that Jewish leaders like Salam ibn Abu al-Hukak and Huyay ibn Akhtab started their conspiracies against Islam. The latter Jewish leader was the architect of the campaign known as the Expedition of the Moat, launched by the allied Arab forces to destroy Medina. Chapter 25. Furthermore, the idea of persuading the Qurayza to join that effort was his own brainchild. When those two Jewish leaders were removed from the scene, the leadership of the Jews in Khaybar fell to a man called Usayd ibn Rizam. Usayd followed the same policies and tactics of his predecessors. He started by renewing the pact which the Jews of Khaybar had with the Arab tribe of the Ghatafan against the common enemy, the Muslims. Among Arab tribes, the Ghatafan was known for hard fighting. Their quarters were not very far from Khaybar. They were the tribe which joined the Quraysh in marching on Medina a year earlier in response to the Jewish efforts with the declared objective of annihilating the Muslims. Treachery always at hand. Since alliances were usually short-lived in Arabia at that time, Usayd felt that a renewal of alliances was necessary as a sound precaution in case a new confrontation with the Muslims took place. Never did Usayd ibn Rizam think that the course which had been followed by the Jews ever since the advent of Islam was the cause of their defeat at the hands of the Muslims, or that common sense required him to move in a totally different direction. When the Prophet heard of Usayd's activities, he sought to neutralize that source of danger. He sent 30 of his companions from the Ansar, headed by Abdullah ibn Rawaha, with instructions to try to persuade Usayd ibn Rizam to follow a more sensible approach to the relationship between the Jews and the Muslims. When Abdullah ibn Rawaha and his men arrived at Khaybar, they had a meeting with Usayd. Both sides agreed to exchange pledges of security and safety until they had finalized the business in hand. Abdullah ibn Rawaha explained that the Muslims did not want any military conflict with the Jews or anyone else. They would much rather have peaceful relations with all parties. He assured Usayd that the Jews need not fear any threat or danger from the Muslims if they were willing to live in peace with them. He proposed that Usayd should go to Medina where he could conclude a peace agreement with the Prophet. Usayd agreed to do this and went with them, accompanied by a number of his fellow Jews with that aim in mind. They had not been traveling long, however, when Usayd started to have second thoughts. These prompted him to try to assassinate Abdullah ibn Rawaha. The latter, however, was quick to see what Usayd was trying to do, and he managed to kill him on the spot. Yet another Islamic effort at peaceful coexistence with the Jews was thus nipped in the bud. As usual, the bitter fruits were reaped by the treacherous. Usayd ibn Rizam was succeeded by Salam ibn Mishkam as leader of the Jews in Khaybar. Singular as it might seem, Salam could not benefit from past lessons. He followed the same course as his predecessors and went about confirming past alliances and concluding pacts of hatred against Islam. I for an easy gain. After the Pact of Al-Hudaybiyah, the Prophet felt that the Muslims were now in a position to neutralize the threat posed by the Jews in Khaybar. He therefore called on his companions to mobilize again and start the march towards Khaybar. He made it clear that only those who went with him for the Umrah at Al-Hudaybiyah were allowed to join him this time. As already seen, many people did not wish to join him then because they feared that the Quraysh were in a position to stop the Muslims by force and inflict a heavy defeat on them. These same people, however, realized that the Muslims were now set on a winning course. In the surah which comments on the events of Al-Hudaybiyah, there is a definite promise by God to the Muslims that they would have more chances to gain spoils of war. The very people who had grave misgivings about the prospects of the Muslims when they marched towards Mecca were now absolutely certain that there was great booty to grab. Deep inside them, they realized that Quranic promises always came true. It was natural, then, that they should try to join the Muslim army on this expedition, which promised great immediate benefits. The Prophet, however, told them that they were allowed to join the army only if they were keen to serve the cause of God. If they were after the booty which would result from an Islamic victory, their services were not required. Thus, only those who went with the Prophet on the mission of Al-Hudaybiyah were allowed to go with him this time, in addition perhaps to a few others who were known to be good Muslims. The Muslim army was only 1,400 men strong, with only 200 horsemen, and the task confronting it was formidable indeed. Khaybar was a well-fortified city, and the Jews could raise very large forces. Moreover, the Prophet always tried to take his enemies by surprise. This time, however, the Jews of Khaybar received intelligence of his intention. It is reported that Abdullah ibn Ubay, the man usually described as the chief of the hypocrites, sent them a warning the moment he realized that the Prophet was planning to attack Khaybar. As soon as they received this information, the Jews started to make their preparations. They put their city on a war footing, keeping their women and children well protected in their forts and holding military exercises and training every day outside their city. Khaybar was about 160 kilometers to the north of Medina, a distance which took 5 days of traveling by camel. Appointing his companion Sibah ibn Arfata to deputize for him in Medina, the Prophet set out in the month of Al-Muharram on the 7th year of his emigration to Medina, August AD 628. Realizing that speed was an essential factor in taking the Khaybar Jews by surprise, he covered the whole distance in only 3 tiring stages, each taking 1 day, and arrived in the vicinity of Khaybar at dawn of the 4th day. The Muslims encamped in an open valley called Al-Raji on the route between Ghatafan and Khaybar. They wanted to block the route so that the Ghatafan could not come to the aid of their Jewish allies. Some reports suggest that the Ghatafan decided to send some of their forces to help the Jews. Shortly after setting out, they heard noises in their own quarters. They thought that the Muslims were planning to attack their quarters after they had left. They therefore went back and stayed in their own town to defend it against the Muslims, should the latter attack it. What had probably taken place was that the Prophet had actually sent a detachment of his forces when he realized that the Ghatafan were planning to support their Jews, in order to frighten the Ghatafan away from supporting their allies. Other reports suggest that the Prophet actually asked the Ghatafan not to support the Jews of Khaybar, and he promised to give the Ghatafan a portion of what the Muslims stood to win when they achieved victory. Whichever report was true, the practical result was that the Ghatafan did not actually help the Jews and left them to face the Muslims on their own. It is necessary to explain here that Khaybar was not a city in the traditional sense of the word. It was a large oasis, very fertile, with farms and orchards stretching over a very large area indeed. Its people were not concentrated in a single built-up area forming the city. They were scattered over the neighboring hills and valleys. Their homes were fortified in the middle of their farms and orchards. The terrain was very difficult for any attacking army because it would have had to fight in the farms, in the valleys, and over several hills. From the military point of view, Khaybar was divided into 3 sections: Al-Nata, Al-Shaq, and Al-Katiba. Each section included several forts. Al-Nata, for example, incorporated the forts of Naim, Al-Sab, and Al-Zubair. The most prominent forts of Al-Shaq included were Ubay and Al-Bari. The Al-Katiba section also comprised numerous forts which included Al-Wati, Sulalem, and Nizar. All these forts were built on high land. Some of them were on top of hills. The population of Khaybar were, generally speaking, experienced fighters. Indeed, the Jewish concentration in Khaybar was the strongest, richest, and best armed in Arabia, so it was very difficult for the Muslims to attack such a city. But the Jews generally were not the sort of people who fought in open battlefields. They preferred to fight in front of their forts and castles. Should the battle go against them, they were then able to retreat into their castles and forts and try to withstand a long siege. Obviously, they hoped that their attackers would grow wary of the long siege and go away. This was the reason which prompted the Prophet to march to Khaybar. Had he not done so, the Jews of Khaybar would have continued to urge others to attack the Muslims. The pattern of raising Arab tribes against the Muslims would be repeated again and again. There was no other way of stopping the Jewish aggression except by attacking the Jews in their own castles. When the Muslim army arrived in the vicinity of Khaybar, the Prophet wanted to encamp near Al-Nata section and its forts. One of his companions, Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, said to him, "The people of Al-Nata are highly renowned for their marksmanship. They can cast arrows a greater distance than most people, and they are better than most at hitting their targets. Moreover, they are well above us in their forts. This gives them an added advantage, with their arrows gathering more speed as they travel down towards us. If we encamp here, we cannot guard ourselves fully against a night attack which they may plan and in which they would take advantage of their palm trees, which would give them added cover. It would be wiser to encamp at some other place." The Prophet said to him, "Your advice is certainly sound." He ordered his army to move backwards so that they were well away from the forts and would not be hit by sniper arrows. This attitude of the Prophet is reminiscent of his attitude at Badr, when Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundhir also objected to the place in which the army was planning to encamp. There also the Prophet acted on the advice of Al-Hubab, who apparently had a keen strategic eye. Indeed, the Prophet was always willing to act on any sound advice put to him in matters of strategy or policy. Such areas were left for him to decide as a human being. Hence, he acted at his own discretion, without imposing his will on his companions. No matter how grave or trivial the business in hand was, the Prophet was always willing to accept sound advice. By so doing, he has given an example for Muslim rulers in following generations. He has shown the true meaning of the fact that Islam is a system based on consultative government. Taken by surprise. The people of Khaybar were fast asleep when these events took place. They did not notice anything until their farm workers went out of the forts carrying their tools to go about their farm work. When they saw the Prophet and his companions, they were panic-stricken. They shouted, "Muhammad and his army! Muhammad and his army!" Peace be upon him. They ran away to their forts, warning their people against the impending calamity. The Prophet wanted to add to their panic and shouted, "God is supreme! Khaybar is destroyed! When we arrive in the enemy's land, those who have been forewarned will have a very bad morning." The people of Khaybar awoke to this very unpleasant surprise. They realized that the initiative was totally with the Prophet. The options open to them were either to surrender or to fight to the last man. As the Prophet and his companions encamped at such a close distance, it was impossible for the Jews of Khaybar to launch an offensive. They had to go on the defensive. This gave the Muslims a great psychological advantage. But the Jews also realized that in their previous encounters with the Muslims, their forts and castles were of no great use to them. Eventually, the Muslims were able to score total victory. Some of the Jews in Khaybar were evacuees from Medina. To them, seeing the Muslims besieging their forts again did not bode any good omen. They felt fear creeping into their hearts. That in itself was half the battle. Fighting began at the fort of Naim, in which the Jews had amassed a large force. Their leader in that fort was Salam ibn Mishkam, the overall chief of the Jews of Khaybar. Here, the Jews were prepared for a long and fierce battle. The Prophet, however, tried to score a psychological victory, which he hoped would avert the need for actual fighting. Knowing that the Jews considered their money to be as dear to them as their own lives, he wanted to demonstrate to them that they might be better off if they surrendered. If they insisted on fighting, he wanted them to understand that their loss would be financial as well as military. He therefore ordered his companions to cut down the palm trees which belonged to the Jews. Nearly 400 trees were felled on his instructions, but he realized that there was no sign of the Jews surrendering. He then ordered a halt to the tree felling and prepared to launch his attack. Shrewd military strategy. The Prophet realized that in order to achieve a total victory over the Jews in such an unusual city as Khaybar, he had to smash their power in every one of these forts and castles. His strategic plan was to assign to small detachments of his forces the task of engaging the Jews in several forts while concentrating the larger part of his forces against one fort, putting it under siege until it surrendered. He would then move on to the next fort. He divided his forces into small sections according to their clans and tribes. He also appointed a commander for every unit so that there would be a great deal of competition between the different units. This also helped in alternating several units between the tasks of engaging enemy forces and of mounting a siege. In this way, no unit was overtired through sustained pressure. After all, the Muslim units shared in the military effort, with none of them bearing the larger share of the burden on its own. Here, the Prophet was clearly a great military commander, putting a different plan for each encounter with the enemy according to the nature of the encounter, taking all factors into consideration: the terrain, the size of his forces in relation to enemy forces, the psychological advantage. In Khaybar, the Prophet's plan did not differ from the most advanced military plans for urban and forest fighting. The first battle was fierce, and the Jews showed solid resistance to the Muslims every inch of the way. The Muslims, however, were more than a match for the defenders. Every time the Jews tried to come out of their fort to repel their attackers, the Muslims forced them to retreat inside. The siege continued day after day, as the fierce fighting could not tilt the balance decisively either way. The battle of the fort of Naim continued for 7 days, with the Prophet assigning the Muslims' banner to a different one of his companions on each successive day. None, however, was able to force the doors of the fort open. Finally, on the 7th day, the Prophet assigned the banner to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was able to break the power of the defenders and force the fort wide open. It is said that Ali was suffering from a severe eye inflammation, so he could hardly see his way. When the Prophet assigned the banner to him, Ali drew the Prophet's attention to his complaint, and the Prophet wiped Ali's eyes with his saliva and prayed for his recovery. Ali's complaint was immediately relieved, and he never again experienced a recurrence of his eye inflammation. At one point in the Battle of the Fort of Naim, one of the bravest and best renowned Jewish fighters, Marhab, challenged the Muslims to a duel. Ali himself fought him and was able to kill him. A Muslim soldier, Mahmud ibn Maslama, was sitting at one point next to the wall of the fort, and someone from inside the fort threw a large stone which fell on his head and killed him. His brother, Muhammad ibn Maslama, was able to take revenge for his dead brother. The Jewish commander Salam ibn Mishkam died during the siege and was succeeded by Al-Harith ibn Abi Zainab. When the fort of Naim fell to the Muslims, the Jews who were there withdrew to the fort next to it, Al-Sab. When the Muslims put them under siege, the Jews made a determined fight and attacked with large forces. The Muslims were forced to retreat some distance, but the unit commanded by Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundir was able to stand firm. The Prophet encouraged the Muslims to double their efforts in their jihad, and Al-Hubab was able to check the Jews' advance and then force them on the retreat. They went back into their fort and closed its gates. In their counterattack, the Muslims were able to force the gates of the fort open and started to kill anyone who resisted them or to take him prisoner. The fort of Al-Sab then surrendered to the Muslims. In Al-Sab fort, the Muslims found large amounts of provisions: barley, dates, butter, cooking oil, honey, and several other items. Before that, they were without any provisions of their own. They were more or less in a famine. The Prophet was worried that the Muslims might be preoccupied with carrying away these provisions, and he asked one of his companions to convey his orders that they were allowed to eat and to give their horses and camels what they needed, but not to carry with them any amount of those provisions. In that fort, the Muslims found buried under the ground a large quantity of mangonel, shields, swords, and other weapons. They used them for the rest of the battle, and thus they were far better equipped than they were when they had started. The discovery was made through a Jew who had fallen prisoner during the siege of the fort of Naim. This man was in fear for his life, and he came to the Prophet and volunteered this information in return for an assurance from the Prophet that neither he nor any one of his family would be killed. A battle at every fort. The next fort where the Jews were planning to fight was that of Al-Zubair. The Muslims mounted a 3-day siege, but the Jews would not come out. Then the Prophet discovered that a stream of water ran into that fort from the back. He ordered the stream to be diverted so that the besieged would not have their supply of water. The trick worked, and the Jews were forced to come out and fight. The battle was ferocious, with casualties on both sides. The Muslims, however, were able to gain the upper hand, and Al-Zubair, the last fort in Al-Natah section, fell to them. The Jews were now in the next section, Al-Shak, defending the nearest of its forts, which had the name of Ubay. This fort was on a hill known as Mount Shamran, where the Jews fought a determined battle. There were several duels between the best-known fighters of both sides. These went in favor of the Muslims. The Muslim commander in the battle of the fort of Ubay was Abu Dujana, whom we have seen in early battles, especially Uhud, demonstrating his fearless courage and exceptional determination. This time, he was able to force his way into the fort, and its defenders lost no time in escaping to the next one, Al-Bari. When the Prophet and his companions moved to that fort, the Jews had made up their minds to do all they could to halt the Muslim advance. The defenders of the fort of Al-Bari were perhaps the best marksmen with arrows among all the Jews of Khaybar. In this encounter, they justified their reputation by pouring on the Muslims a shower of arrows and stones. Indeed, some arrows hit the Prophet's own clothes. At this point, the Prophet ordered his companions to bring out the mangonel and start using it. The Jewish defendants of the fort were terrified and fled to the next section. Thus, the Al-Shak section of Khaybar and its forts had fallen completely to the Muslims. Retreating into the last section of Al-Katiba, the Jews put up their defenses first at the fort of Al-Qamus, where the chiefs were the family of Al-Hukak, to which belonged several of the Jewish leaders who shared in the earlier conspiracies against the Muslims. The Muslims besieged this fort for 20 days until it surrendered to the Muslim commander Ali ibn Abi Talib. A large number of women were taken prisoner from this fort. Following the universal traditions of the time, these women prisoners were enslaved. The Prophet chose from among them a woman called Safiya bint Huyay, the daughter of Huyay ibn Akhtab, who was the Jewish leader, perhaps most hostile to Islam. The Prophet set Safiya free before marrying her, so she became a mother of the believers. After the surrender, with all these forts falling to the Muslims, the Jews were forced to retreat to their 2 final forts, Al-Wati and Sulalem. These were besieged for over 2 weeks before the Jews realized that they had no hope of turning the scales against the Muslims. Hence, they offered to surrender in return for their safety. Their leader Kinana ibn al-Rabi ibn Abi al-Hukak came down to sign a document of surrender with the Prophet. The surrender agreement stipulated that none of their fighters would be put to death. They would be allowed to leave Khaybar and its vicinity, taking with them their women and children. They would abandon all their claims over their land, money, horses, and arms. To these conditions, which were voluntarily offered by the Jews, the Prophet added, "But all guarantees given you would be abrogated if you withhold anything from me." Thus, all Khaybar fell to the Muslims, who were now in possession of all its wealth and land. When the peace agreement was made, the people of Khaybar started to have second thoughts about leaving their land. Hence, they came to the Prophet requesting him to allow them to stay and work in the farms and orchards. They said to him, "We are better at this sort of job than you, and the land would yield much better crops if we work on it." They offered to give the Muslims half the yield of all the land in Khaybar in return. The Prophet accepted these offers and amended the peace agreement accordingly, but added the proviso that the Muslims would evacuate the Jews from Khaybar whenever they chose. Remaining Jewish centers. These were other centers of Jewish population in Arabia. One of these was at Fadak. When the Jews there heard of the peace agreement reached between the Prophet and the people of Khaybar, they decided not to go to war with the Muslims. They sent a delegation to meet the Prophet, and a similar peace agreement to that with the people of Khaybar was reached. Thus, the Muslims won Khaybar by force of arms, while Fadak was gained without any need to fight. Hence, Fadak became the property of the Prophet as the head of the Muslim state according to Islamic legislation. The next Jewish concentration was at Wadi al-Qura, to which the Prophet marched after leaving Khaybar. He besieged the place for several days, upon which his population surrendered and entered a peace agreement with the Muslims on the same terms as those of the agreement with Khaybar. The Jews of Tema, on the other hand, did not fight. They surrendered voluntarily to the Muslims. Thus, all the Jews in Arabia finally yielded to the authority of the Prophet and relinquished all their own authority. The Muslims in Medina were now in a much better position with regard to security. They feared no enemy to the north after the surrender of the Jews. Nor was there any enemy to fear to the south now that they had entered into the famous peace agreement with the Quraysh at Al-Hudaybiyah. Return of old immigrants. When the Muslims had finished the job of conquering Khaybar and all its forts and castles fell to them, they had a pleasant surprise. They were joined there by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, who had emigrated to Abyssinia about 15 years earlier with a number of the companions of the Prophet. The events which necessitated that emigration, its effects and consequences on the Muslims, and the purposes it served here have already been discussed in Chapter 10. Many who emigrated with Ja'far rejoined the Prophet at Medina at different times. A group of them, however, continued to live in Abyssinia, having been ordered by the Prophet to do so. A short while before the Prophet set out towards Khaybar, he sent his companion, Amr ibn Umayyah al-Damri, who acted as his ambassador at large, to Negus, the ruler of Abyssinia, asking him to facilitate the return of the Muslims who sought refuge in his country. He himself had adopted Islam. On receiving the Prophet's request, he immediately arranged for 2 boats to carry the Muslims on their way back home. The immigrants headed to join the Prophet, and that meant that they went straight to Khaybar. There were 16 men and a few women, but there were others with them from Abyssinia and Yemen. The Prophet was very pleased when he saw Ja'far and his brethren. He hugged Ja'far and kissed him on his forehead between the eyes. He said, "I am not sure which of the 2 gives me greater pleasure, the conquest of Khaybar or the return of Ja'far." The Prophet treated the returning immigrants on an equal footing with those who fought at Khaybar, giving each one of them an equal share of the spoils of war. Those spoils of war were indeed great. The conquest of Khaybar and the gains the Muslims achieved as a result were part of the fulfillment of the promise God made to the Muslims as a reward for their steadfastness and declared willingness to fight the Quraysh at Al-Hudaybiyah. That promise is contained in the Surah 48 entitled The Conquest. The promise was that God would grant the Muslims a victory coming soon and a great deal of spoils of war, which they would take for themselves. The Khaybar expedition took place barely 2 months after Al-Hudaybiyah. The Muslims' gains were great, but they were not gold and silver. They were orchards and farms, horses and camels, swords and arrows. It was such a fertile land that its yield of dates alone was estimated for purposes of zakat at 40,000 camel loads. The Prophet set aside 1/5 of all that the Muslims had gained. In effect, this 1/5 was the land of the military section of Al-Katiba. It is reported that that section included at least 40,000 date palms, which yielded annually something like 8,000 camel loads. According to Islam, 1/5 of everything the Muslims gain in battle goes to the public treasury. Thus, Al-Katiba was the share of the state. The rest was divided into 1,800 shares. These shares were of equal value and were distributed among the soldiers of the Muslim army, each man getting 1 share. Each horse was given 2 shares. This confirms that there were 1,400 Muslim men in that army. They had only 200 horses with them. Some reports suggest that the Prophet divided what the Muslims had gained in Khaybar into two halves. He then divided one half into 1,800 shares as explained. The other half was given to the Muslim state in order to run its business. If one remembers that the peace agreement which was finally concluded after the Battle of Khaybar stipulated that the Jews could work the land for half its yield of all crops, one need only know the yield of each share which the Muslims had in order to have a good idea of the size of their booty. A clue for such a calculation is found in the fact that the Prophet married one of his companions to a young lady. The marriage was consummated without any stipulation of a dowry. The man did not give his wife anything by the way of dowry, since the man was among those who attended Al-Hudaybiyah. He had a share in Khaybar. When he was about to die, he said to those who attended his deathbed, "The Prophet married me to my wife, and I did not give her any dowry. I would like you to bear witness that I give up to her my share in Khaybar as her dowry." She sold that share for 100,000 dirhams. When one reads that the Prophet used to store provisions for his family for a whole year in advance, one knows that he was able to do so only after the conquest of Khaybar. It is true to say that the Muslims' fortunes were totally different after Khaybar. Again, this is the result of honest and sincere effort exerted by the Muslims for the cause of God and in anticipation of no return other than winning the pleasure of God. When Muslims do that, they do not only achieve their goal with respect to earning God's pleasure, but they also win material gains which ensure for them a comfortable life in this world. Compassion. Two incidents which took place in the wake of the Battle of Khaybar give an insight into the widely different attitudes of the Muslims and their enemies. It is reported that Bilal, a companion of the Prophet, was taking Safiya bint Huyay, whom the Prophet later married, and a cousin of hers from one place to another. Bilal deliberately planned his route so that they would pass by the place where those Jews who were killed in the battle were about to be buried. When the two girls saw the dead, Safiya's cousin cried and lamented loudly. The Prophet disliked what Bilal had done and reproached him severely. "Are you devoid of mercy? You take a young girl to the place where the killed are?" Bilal apologized, saying that he did not think that the Prophet would object to what he did. He thought it might be beneficial if the girl was made to see the dead from among her people, but he also promised that he would never do such a thing again. Here, the Prophet reproaches one of his earliest companions for paying little heed to human considerations. To him, the fact that the Jews were hardened enemies of Islam was no reason for treating them unkindly. Indeed, the reverse was true. Kind treatment might overcome their hostility, and Islam might benefit by the establishment of better relations with them in future. Revenge. The other incident took place when the Prophet and the Muslims had had some rest after their hard battle. A woman called Zainab bint al-Harith, the wife of Salam ibn Mishkam, the chief of Khaybar, who died during the siege of the first fort, prepared a lamb for eating. She had inquired beforehand which part of lamb the Prophet liked best. She was told that he liked the shoulder. When the lamb was well cooked, she poisoned it and put an extra dose of poison in the lamb's shoulder. She then took it to the Prophet and gave it to him as a present. The Prophet took one shoulder and had a bite of it, but he did not like the taste and spat it out. He said, "This joint tells me that it is poisoned." One of his companions, Bishr ibn al-Bara, was with him at the time. Bishr ate a little of the lamb and found it acceptable. The poison soon had its effect and he died quickly. The woman was called in and the Prophet asked her about the lamb. She confessed that she had poisoned it. Under questioning, she explained her reason to the Prophet. "You know what you have done to my people. I thought that if you were a king, I would get my revenge and we would get rid of you. If you were truly a prophet, you would be told of the poison." The Prophet pardoned her. Some reports, however, suggest that she was put to death in punishment for killing Bishr ibn al-Bara. The traditions which suggest that she was pardoned are weightier. Moreover, they are more in line with the attitude of the Prophet. He knew that people were always on the lookout for a chance to get some revenge on their conquerors, especially immediately after their defeat. It was his habit, after every success in battle, to do something which would help in turning over a new leaf in the relations between the Muslims and those whom they had just defeated. In the earlier campaign of Al-Mustalak, several hundred people of that tribe were enslaved after being taken prisoner. in the normal tradition of the time. After the battle, the Prophet married Javeria bint al-Harith, the daughter of the chief of Al-Mustalak. The marriage resulted in the immediate release from slavery of all those who were taken prisoner by the Muslims. The companions of the Prophet would not hear of having his in-laws as their slaves. Hence, they gave them their freedom, demonstrating their love and respect for the Prophet. A new bride for the Prophet. After Khaybar, the Prophet married the daughter of the man who did more than any other Jew to undermine Islam and to put an end to it. Huyay ibn Akhtab, the chief of the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir, had determined to fight Islam tooth and nail from the very first day of the Prophet's settlement in Medina. Huyay was one of the chiefs of Al-Nadir who plotted to kill the Prophet when he went to their quarters, seeking their help in accordance with the terms of the covenant which he had concluded with them on his arrival in Medina. This assassination attempt resulted in the evacuation of the Jews of Al-Nadir from Medina. No sooner had they settled in Khaybar than he started to put into effect his plan of uniting all the enemies of Islam in a concerted attack on Medina with the aim of exterminating the Muslims altogether. It was Safiya, the daughter of Huyay himself, whom the Prophet decided to marry when the Battle of Khaybar was over. One must not underestimate the significance of such a marriage, especially in the tribal environment of Arabia, where marriage relations between the families of the chiefs of different tribes signified alliances between those tribes. The Prophet wanted his companions and the vanquished Jews to realize that he was opening a new page in his relations with yesterday's enemies. The Prophet would not have married Safiya had he intended not to treat her on an equal footing with his other wives. He realized that his marriage would go a long way to reassure the Jews that the door was open for them to have friendly relations with Islam. Safiya was a young woman when the Prophet married her. Some reports suggest that she was only 17, but that may not be very accurate, considering that in Arabia no group or tribe kept records or dates of events. She might probably have been a few years older, considering that she had been married twice before. Her first husband was Salam ibn Mishkam, the prominent Jew who took over the overall leadership of the Khaybar Jews a short while before the Battle of Khaybar and died when the Muslims were besieging the fort of Naim. It is not certain how long that marriage lasted, but it seems possible that Salam divorced his wife sometime before his death. Her second husband was Kinana ibn al-Rabi ibn Abi al-Hukak, who belonged to a family which gave the Jews many of their leaders. Kinana was killed in Khaybar towards the end of the battle. In the traditions of the time, Safiya would have been a slave girl in the Prophet's household. The Prophet, however, did not keep any slave man or woman who was given into his hands in bondage for any length of time. When his companions told him that Safiya should not be given to any person other than himself because of her noble birth, which incidentally was traceable to the Prophet Aaron, Moses' brother, peace be upon them both, the Prophet gave Safiya the freedom of choice. He told her that she could rejoin her family or he would set her free and marry her. She chose to be his wife. After their marriage, the Prophet did all he could to help Safiya forget the events of the past, which were naturally a source of grief to her. She is reported to have said later, "God's messenger, peace be upon him, was very hateful to me because he killed my husband and my father. However, he kept apologizing to me, saying that my father had raised the Arabs against him and did this and did that until all my hard feelings disappeared." One day, the Prophet went into Safiya's room to find her crying. When he asked her why, she said that Aisha and Hafsa, who were both his wives, kept talking about her, belittling her position. They said that either of them was far superior to her because they were distant cousins of the Prophet, and that he married them for their personalities, not for any other reason. He said to her, "Why did you not reply to them and say, 'How can you be superior to me when Aaron, peace be upon him, is my father,' meaning her lineage ended with him, and Moses, peace be upon him, is my uncle, and my husband is Muhammad, peace be upon him." It is reported that when Safiya was still a young girl, she saw in her dream that the moon fell into her lap. She mentioned her dream to her father, and he hit her hard in the face. He said to her, "You surely wish to be wed to the king of the Arabs." The slap left a visible mark on her face, which the Prophet noticed when he married her. He asked her about that mark, and she told him its cause. Winning people's hearts. It has already been reported that according to their agreement with the Prophet, the Jews at Khaybar would stay and look after the land in return for half its produce. The Prophet accepted that and allowed them to remain on condition that the Muslims could ask them to leave whenever they wished and they would leave without any complaint. This shows how the Prophet did not harbor any hard feelings against his old enemies. He did not wish to take revenge against any one of them, despite their past conspiracies and repeated attempts to cause Islam a great deal of harm. When they had surrendered and it was clear that they could not cause the Muslims any more trouble, no real purpose would have been served by putting their men to death or sending them into exile. He therefore allowed them to stay. Moreover, the Prophet emphasized to the Muslims that they should treat the Jews fairly. The Jews complained at one point after they were allowed to stay that some Muslims went into their farms and took away some of their fruits or crops which they found. The Prophet ordered the Muslims to assemble and spoke to them. The Jews have complained to me that you have been taking things away from their farms and barns. You know that we have reached an agreement with them, giving them security for their lives and possessions in their land. We also agreed that they would work on the land for us. No Muslim is allowed to have anything which belongs to anyone with whom the Muslims have a peace agreement unless he pays him its fair price. All subsequent dealings between the Muslims and the Jews were then conducted on this basis. When the Muslims had returned to Medina, the Prophet used to send his companion, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, to Khaybar every year to estimate the amount of the crops so that it could be shared out equally between the Muslims and the Jews. Sometimes, when he had made his estimates and pointed out which share belonged to the Muslims and which belonged to the Jews, they would tell him, "You have been unfair to us." He would answer, "You may have either share." That gave the Jews the best reassurance that they were treated fairly. They told Abdullah, on this standard of justice, everything on earth and in heaven can prosper. Among the things which came into the possession of the Muslims as a result of their victory in Khaybar were a number of sheets and pages from the Old Torah. The Jews asked the Prophet to hand back these sheets to them. He did so willingly. To them, those sheets had a special value. To be able to have them back after their defeat filled them with admiration for the Prophet. It is the normal practice in most wars that the victor plays havoc with whatever the defeated regard as holy. When the Byzantines conquered Jerusalem in the year 70 BC, they burnt the sacred books which belonged to the Jews. No such practice was followed in any battle the Muslims fought. The Battle of Khaybar put an end to one source of danger which, with the Muslims, had to contend for several years. It smashed the political and economic power of the Jews in Arabia. As the power of Islam continued to increase, the Jewish influence paled into insignificance. What is more, the enemies of Islam had to revise their calculations. In less than 3 or 4 months, the Muslims were able to neutralize the Quraysh and to smash the power of the Jews. How different the Arabian scene had become after the Battle of Khaybar. Back with the Quraysh. When the Muslims, led by the Prophet, marched from Medina towards Khaybar, their fortunes granted great interest all over Arabia, especially from the Quraysh. As events actually developed, the conquest of Khaybar by the Muslims was a great achievement which few people had expected to come about so relatively quickly and easily. The Quraysh certainly followed the events with great sympathy for the Jews. It was less than 18 months earlier that the Quraysh and the Jews had been partners in an all-out attempt to destroy Medina and exterminate the Muslims. Now the Quraysh was neutralized with the conclusion of the peace treaty at Al-Hudaybiyah. Sympathies were not expected to undergo a marked change with the mere signing of a peace treaty. Hence, the Quraysh could only wish that the Jews of Khaybar could achieve on their own what their combined forces had failed to achieve. Views differed among the Quraysh people as to the result they expected in the encounter between the Muslims and the Jews. Some of them, who were familiar with the strength and armament of the Jews and with their strong fortifications, and were aware of the alliance which they had with the Ghatafan, expected that the battle would end in the favor of the Jews. Others, who admired the unity of the Muslims, their determination, discipline, mutual cooperation, and willingness to sacrifice their all for their faith, did not give the Jews much of a chance. There was much argument between the two sides, and large bets were placed on the outcome of the expected battle. Hence, they were very eager for any piece of news which might be carried by a lonely traveler or a caravan. Some of them went to the extent of going out of Mecca to sit on the routes followed by travelers in order to question any passerby. So much for the situation in Mecca. Back in the Muslim camp at Khaybar, a man who had adopted Islam a short while earlier and taken part in the Battle of Khaybar came to the Prophet after the battle was over and said, "Messenger of God, I left much of my money with my wife, Sheba, and a number of businessmen in Mecca owe me large sums of money. I beg leave to go and collect my debts." Having obtained the Prophet's permission to do so, this man, Al-Hajjaj ibn Alat of the tribe of Sulaim, said to him, "I may have to say things which may not be totally correct." The Prophet allowed him to do so. Al-Hajjaj traveled as fast as he could until he approached Mecca, where he found at Thaniyat al-Bada on the outskirts some men from the Quraysh waiting for anyone who would be able to give them any information about the Prophet and the Muslims. Unaware that Al-Hajjaj had become a Muslim, they said when they saw him coming towards them, "This is Al-Hajjaj ibn Alat, and he must have the information we are looking for." They rushed towards him and said, "Hajjaj, we have heard that the man," meaning the Prophet, "has marched towards Khaybar, the Jewish city, which is the garden of Hijaz." Al-Hajjaj replied, "Yes, I heard of that, and I have very happy news for you." Al-Hajjaj reports, "They quickly gathered round my she-camel and asked me to speak. I said, Muhammad, peace be upon him, was soundly beaten, and his companions suffered heavy casualties, and Muhammad himself was taken prisoner, peace be upon him. The Jews decided not to kill him, but to send him to you here in Mecca so that you could kill him in revenge for those of your leaders who were killed by him." When they heard this, they rushed to give that news to the people of Mecca and were saying to everyone around that the awaited news had certainly arrived and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was about to be sent to them in shackles and fetters to be killed. As everyone was so elated, I said to them, "Help me collect my money from my debtors, because I want to go to Khaybar and gather as much as I can of what Muhammad's army has left behind, peace be upon him, before other traders beat me to it." Many rushed to my aid and collected my debts for me in a very short time. I then went to my wife and asked her to give me my money, which I left with her for safekeeping, giving her the same excuse I gave to the other people of Mecca. Al-Hajjaj's news caused a great stir in Mecca. To the hardened people of the Quraysh, it was an unexpected piece of information which would mark a radical change in the situation in Arabia. With the eclipse of the rising power of the Muslims, the Quraysh was sure to regain its supremacy. On the other hand, there were many people in Mecca who had adopted Islam, but kept that fact secret. They were at a loss. If the news was true, they faced a very bleak future. Moreover, the sympathies of the Hashemites, the Prophet's own clan, were with the Muslims. They did not wish Muhammad, peace be upon him, to suffer any defeat. One of their leaders, Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's own uncle, was troubled by what he heard, but wished to confirm it for himself. He sought to speak to Al-Hajjaj ibn Alat. Finding him in a tent which served as the shop of a Meccan trader, he came close to him and said, "Hajjaj, what is this piece of news you have been spreading?" Al-Hajjaj replied, "Can I trust you with safekeeping of what I wish to deposit with you?" When Al-Abbas answered in the affirmative, Al-Hajjaj asked him to wait until he had finished collecting his debts, when he would come to see him. When he had done so and was about to leave, Al-Hajjaj met Al-Abbas and said to him, "Listen carefully and keep what I am going to tell you a secret for 3 days, because I fear that the Quraysh people would pursue me hard if they know what I am going to tell you. After 3 days, you are free to say whatever you wish." Al-Abbas promised to keep his secret for 3 days. Al-Hajjaj then told him, "By God, I have left your nephew having wed their king's daughter," meaning Safiya bint Huyay. "He has certainly conquered Khaybar. The whole city and its surrounding land now belong to him and his companions." He continued, "This is certainly the truth. Keep it a secret, please. I am a Muslim, and I have come here only to take my money. I feared that if I left it, I would never be paid by my debtors. After 3 days, you can publicize what I have just told you, because it is certainly the truth." Al-Hajjaj then departed, and Al-Abbas went back home reassured and happy. After 3 days, Al-Abbas attended to his appearance so that he looked at his most elegant, put on his best suit, and went out towards the Kaaba, where he did his tawaf. Still elated with their happy news, people from the Quraysh remarked as they saw him, Abu al-Fadl. This was an appellation of respect for Al-Abbas, addressing him as the father of his son, Al-Fadl. You are certainly showing patience in the face of this unexpected calamity. He retorted, No, indeed. Muhammad, peace be upon him, has certainly conquered Khaybar and married the daughter of the Jewish king, and has taken all Khaybar and its lands so that it now belongs to him and his companions. Startled and shocked, the Quraysh people asked him, Who told you this? Al-Abbas said that he heard it from the man who gave them the news they wished to hear. He also told them that Al-Hajjaj was a Muslim who came just to take his money and rejoin Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. Thus, disappointment replaced their earlier elation. They threatened that they would have done so-and-so to Al-Hajjaj, but they realized that he had escaped them. This shows what sort of feelings the Quraysh experienced whenever Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Muslims were engaged in battle against a third party. When the Quraysh people realized that the Jewish front had also been neutralized by the Muslims, they could not avoid the conclusion that the Muslims were now the major power in Arabia.